To hear this audiobook in full, please visit the links in the description below. Thank you for your support.
The Communist Postscript by Boris Groys, translated by Thomas H. Ford. Translator's Foreword. First published in German in 2006, Boris Groys's The Communist Postscript is both a revision of standard accounts of the history of the Soviet Union and a philosophical renewal of the idea of communism. It is also a post-communist manifesto. Groys's short text can be read as forming a bookend to the modern experience of communism heralded by the Communist Manifesto. Sharing much of the rhetorical clarity and polemical brio of Marx and Engels's manifesto, the Communist Postscript stands in little need of any explanatory preface. While Groys's arguments are politically challenging and theoretically complex, they are constructed in such a way as to present readers with few obstacles to initial comprehension. Nonetheless, because this is a philosophical book about communism, there are certain difficulties inherent in translating it into English that need to be acknowledged. These problems arise not because English is in effect the hegemonic language of capitalism today. As Groys argues, capitalist economic processes are not linguistic. Capitalism does not in fact speak English nor any other language. Yet English, perhaps more than many other languages, may be said to have accepted and internalized the subordinate social function of language under capitalism. English in many cases advertises what in other languages is veiled, using more traditional means of ideological obfuscation. In exile in America during the war, Brecht commented in his journal on the use of the word sell to mean persuade, as in the sentence, "The task facing the president is that of selling the war to the people." In Brecht's unfinished refugee conversations, this observation is further developed by the character Ziffel, as suggesting that in America, more than elsewhere, ideas are recognized to be commodities. In America, he states, in discussions of scientific or aesthetic problems, one says, "I buy that," in order to express agreement. This proximity of concepts to the commodity form can also be tracked in Anglophone philosophy over the last century. For example, it was in order to draw a distinction between continental philosophy and philosophy in English that William James introduced the metaphor of cash value, of cashing an idea in experience as a way to test its meaningfulness. This metaphor has subsequently become generally accepted in Anglo-American philosophy, embedding reference to market value in arguments about topics that may at first glance appear to be quite remote from commercial concerns. The Communist Postscript suggests that these and other similar figures of language are far less metaphoric than is often thought. Under capitalist conditions, Groys argues, the significance of a concept is indeed primarily measured in terms of its value in the marketplace, and by frequently using English expressions, killer instinct, Batman forever, agreement to disagree, win-win, anything goes, race, class, and gender, to mark moments of strategic irony in his text, Groys acknowledges the expressive openness of the contemporary English language to its own commodification. If, in these ways, English indeed avows its enrollment in the assault of market values against other potential sources of social meaning and forms of social organization, then a brief account of the specifically German context of a few of Groys's key terms may be justified. Central to Groys's understanding of communism is his notion of the linguistification of society. The German word here is Versprachlichung, a term principally employed in sociology and formed from the verb versprachlichen, which means to verbalize or put into words. But the verbalization of society does not capture Groys' meaning. Linguistification as used here does not mean to provide a verbal description of society, but rather to organize and shape society using language. Rather than merely putting non-linguistic social relations and processes into words so as to describe them, linguistification involves their total transformation into language. Probably the best-known prior use of linguistification to translate Versprachlichung in this sense occurs in the section The Linguistification of the Sacred, in the English edition of Jürgen Habermas's Theory of Communicative Action. As for Habermas, linguistification for Groys entails that social practices and beliefs become open to discursive criticism and challenge. But the linguistification central to communism in Groys' account encompasses a much greater range of social existence than is at issue for Habermas. Partly in consequence, while Habermas's notion of communicative action remains oriented towards a horizon of ultimate consensus, linguistification for Groys exacerbates social divisions and contradictions. Groys makes frequent use of the term evidens. This is not a straightforward equivalent of the English evidence, either in everyday language or in philosophical discourse. The predominant philosophical use of evidence in English is relatively continuous with its use in legal and scientific contexts. Evidence is understood as the currency in which a proposition may be verified, corroborated, or empirically cached. It refers to the relevant phenomena that justify advancing a hypothesis as true. Groys's sense remains closer to the German philosophical tradition, in which evidence refers more to an immanent quality of judgment and knowledge than to the external means of deriving and supporting conclusions. In other words, evidence primarily describes what is rationally evident, rather than that which is evidence of or for something. Kant, for example, defines evidence as intuitive certainty in the Critique of Pure Reason. Evidence has been translated here simply as evidence, rather than by other approximations to the German sense such as self-evidence or certainty. This German context should be kept in mind, however. The phrase, the effulgence of evidence, for instance, does not refer to a surfeit of corroborating material, but to the illuminating force of conviction that legitimates judgments. Groys most frequently uses evidence in this sense to describe the force of conviction communicated when an argument previously taken to be logically valid is revealed to contain a paradox. The conviction in question is therefore predominantly critical. The evidence is that of a paradox rather than that of a proof. The logic of paradox outlined by Groys is one that proliferates divisions, a logic committed to sparking contradiction and internal contestation. Groys contrasts this paradoxical logic to the logical regime, often presumed central to Western philosophy. Thale is constituted by principles such as those of non-contradiction and the excluded middle. His shorthand designation for this logic of non-contradiction is formal logic, and he frequently uses this in adjectival form in phrases such as formal logical validity. Rather than resorting to circuitous paraphrases, I have retained this doubled adjective, formal logical, despite its slight awkwardness in English. Groys writes that communism is the transcription of society into the medium of language. The construction of communism could be understood in this sense as an act of translation carried to its utmost extremity, an exercise of hitherto unparalleled translinguistic energies. Like that world-shaking transcriptive enterprise, communism, even translations such as this one are by necessity collective undertakings, and I would like to express my gratitude to Boris Groys for his generous help in reading through the manuscript and suggesting improvements, and to the many others who provided assistance and advice. Introduction. The subject of this book is communism. How one speaks about communism depends on what one takes communism to mean. In what follows, I will understand communism to be the project of subordinating the economy to politics in order to allow politics to act freely and sovereignly. The economy functions in the medium of money. It operates with numbers. Politics functions in the medium of language. It operates with words, with arguments, programs, and petitions, but also with commands, prohibitions, resolutions, and decrees. The communist revolution is the transcription of society from the medium of money to the medium of language. It is a linguistic turn at the level of social praxis. Thus, it is not enough to define man as a speaking being, as is generally done in modem philosophy, notwithstanding all the subtleties and differences that distinguish one individual philosophical position from another. So long as humans live under the conditions of the capitalist economy, they remain fundamentally mute because their fate does not speak to them. If a human is not addressed by his or her fate, then he or she is also incapable of answering it. Economic processes are anonymous and not expressed in words. For this reason, one cannot enter into discussion with economic processes. One cannot change their mind, convince them, persuade them, use words to win them over to one's side. All that can be done is to adapt one's own behavior to what is occurring. Economic failure brooks no argument, just as economic success requires no additional discursive justification. In capitalism, the ultimate confirmation or refutation of human action is not linguistic but economic. It is expressed not with words but with numbers. The force of language as such is thereby annulled. Humans will first truly become beings who exist in language, and through language only one's fate is no longer mute and no longer governs at a purely economic level, but is instead formulated discursively and decided politically from the outset, as is the case in communism. Humans thereby gain the possibility of arguing, protesting, and agitating against the decisions of fate. Such arguments and protests may not always prove effective. They may often be ignored or even suppressed, but they are not as such meaningless. It is entirely meaningful and justified to oppose political decisions in the medium of language, because those decisions were themselves reached in the medium of language. Under capitalist conditions, by contrast, every criticism and every protest is fundamentally senseless, for in capitalism language itself functions as a commodity, that is to say, it is inherently mute. Discourses of critique and protest are recognized as successful when they sell well, and to have failed when they sell poorly. Thus, in no respect can these discourses be distinguished from other commodities, which are equally silent or speak only in self-advertisement. Criticism of capitalism does not operate in the same medium as capitalism itself. In terms of their media, capitalism and its discursive critique are incompatible and so can never encounter each other. Society must first be altered by its linguistification if it is to become subject to any meaningful critique. Thus we can reformulate Marx's famous thesis that philosophy should not interpret the world, but instead change it. For society to become subject to criticism, it must first become communist. This explains the instinctive preference for communism felt by all those equipped with critical consciousness, for only communism performs the total linguistification of human fate that opens the space for a total critique. Communist society can be defined as one in which power and the critique of power operate in the same medium. If the question is posed, therefore, of whether the regime of the former Soviet Union should be regarded as communist, and this question appears unavoidable whenever communism is discussed today, then, in the light of the definition given above, the answer is yes. The Soviet Union went further towards realizing the communist project historically than any other preceding society. During the 1930s, every kind of private property was completely abolished. The political leadership thus gained the possibility of taking decisions that were independent of particular economic interests. But it was not that these particular interests had been suppressed, they simply no longer existed. Every citizen of the Soviet Union worked as an employee of the Soviet state, lived in housing that belonged to the state, shopped in state stores, and traveled through the state's territory by means of state-run transport. What economic interests could such a citizen have? Only the interest that affairs of state would improve, so that the citizen of this state would be better able to profit, no matter whether legally or illegally, through work or through corruption. In the Soviet Union, a fundamental identity between private and public interest thus prevailed. The single external constraint was military. The Soviet Union had to defend itself against its external enemies. By the 1960s, however, the military capabilities of the country had become so great that the possibility of belligerent attack from outside could be rated as extremely improbable. From that moment, the Soviet leadership stood in no objective conflict. It had no internal opposition, and it was also subject to no external constraints that could limit its administrative powers over the country. Its practical decisions could therefore be guided solely by its independent political reason, its own inner convictions. Granted, this political reason, because it was dialectical reason, led the Soviet leadership to abolish communism of its own free will. Yet this decision in no way alters the fact that communism must be considered to have been realized in the Soviet Union. To the contrary, as will be shown in what follows, it is this decision that makes the realization, the embodiment, the incarnation of communism complete. In any case, it cannot be said that the Soviet Union failed economically, for economic failure is only possible in the market. But the market did not exist in the Soviet Union. Hence, neither the economic success nor the economic failure of the political leadership could be established objectively, that is to say, neutrally, non-ideologically. Certain commodities were produced in the Soviet Union, not because they sold well on the market, but because they conformed to an ideological vision of the communist future. And on the other hand, those commodities that could not be legitimated ideologically were not produced. This was true of all commodities, not just the texts or images of official propaganda. In Soviet communism, every commodity became an ideologically relevant statement, just as in capitalism every statement becomes a commodity. One could eat communistically, house and dress oneself communistically, or likewise non-communistically, or even anti-communistically. This meant that in the Soviet Union it was in theory just as possible to protest against the shoes or eggs or sausage then available in the stores as it was to protest against the official doctrines of historical materialism. They could be criticized in the same terms because these doctrines had the same original source as the shoes, eggs, and sausage, namely, the relevant decisions of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the CPSU. Everything in communist existence was the way it was because someone had said that it should be thus and not otherwise, and everything that is decided in language can be criticized linguistically as well. The question of whether communism is possible is therefore profoundly connected to the question of whether government, organization, and political administration can be carried out in language and through language. This central question can be formulated as follows. Can language as such ever exercise sufficient force for society to be governed by linguistic means at all? And if so, under what conditions? This possibility is often flatly denied. In our era especially, the view predominates that language as such has no force at all and is entirely powerless. This assessment accurately reflects the situation of language under capitalist conditions. In capitalism, language is indeed powerless. On the basis of this understanding of language, it is also generally assumed that in communism, the ruling apparatuses characteristically acted behind a facade of official language and compelled people to accept the language of power. And this assumption is not entirely unjustified. Indeed, this suspicion appears to be sufficiently confirmed by the long history of political repression in communist countries. But this leaves open the question of why these oppressive apparatuses acted in favor of one particular ideological conception and not in favor of some alternative conception. For the loyalty of these apparatuses with regard to a particular ideology cannot be taken for granted. To be loyal and to remain loyal, these apparatuses had first to be persuaded, to be won over. Otherwise, they would remain immobile and fail to act, as was indeed the case at the end of the communist states of Eastern Europe. Moreover, under communist conditions, these apparatuses cannot be cleanly separated from the rest of society, for in a society which consists exclusively of state employees, and Soviet society was such a society, the question about who oppresses whom and how cannot be posed in the same way as it is in a society in which the apparatuses of power are more or less cleanly separated from civil society. When state violence in communist states is considered, it must therefore not be forgotten that this violence was conveyed through language, through commands and decrees with which one might comply, but equally might not. The leaderships of the communist countries understood this much better than their opponents did. It was for this reason that these leaderships invested so much force and energy into shaping and maintaining the language of official ideology, and were so incensed by minimal deviations from it. They knew that outside of language they actually possessed nothing, and that if they lost their control over language, they would lose everything. The theory of Marxism-Leninism is ambivalent in its understanding of language, as it is in most matters. On the one hand, everyone who knows this theory has learnt that the dominant language is always the language of the dominant classes. On the other hand, they have learnt, too, that an idea that has gripped the masses becomes a material force, and that on this basis Marxism itself is, or will be, victorious because it is correct. In what follows, it will be shown that the structure of communist society depends precisely on this ambivalence. But first, another question needs to be explored. How ought this ideal linguistic compulsion function? This compulsion that can seize individual people and potentially also the masses, if it is to transform thereby into a revolutionary force of constitutive power? Chapter 1. The Linguistification of Society. Plato was the first in the Western philosophical tradition to elevate language to the medium of total power and the total transformation of society. In the Republic, he declares the rule of the philosophers to be the telos of social development. Plato defines the philosopher, in contrast to the sophist, as someone who does not use language to represent, legitimate and defend private and partial interests, but instead conceives of society as a whole. But to think the totality of society means to think the totality of the language that this society speaks. This is what differentiates philosophy from science or art, each of which uses specialized language of one form or another. Science claims to employ only language that is free of contradiction and logically valid. Art claims to employ language in an aesthetically challenging way. Philosophy, by contrast, uses language in such a way that it addresses the whole of language. But to think and address the whole of language necessarily implies laying claim to the government of the society that speaks this language. In this sense, communism stands in the Platonic tradition. It is a modem form of Platonism in practice. On this basis, it makes sense to look to Plato for an initial answer to the question of how language can exercise sufficient force to allow the speaker to rule over and through language. For Socrates, hero of the Platonic dialogues, the force of conviction radiated by the smooth and well-constructed speeches of the sophists in no way suffices for government. Only the force of logic would be sufficient for that, for the only aspect of a speech that has an effect which cannot be evaded by those confronted with it is its logical evidence. The listener or reader of an evident statement can, of course, willfully decide to contradict the compelling effect of this statement, asserting by this resistance an inner, absolute, subjective freedom with regard to all external constraints, including those of logic. But someone who adopts such a counter-evident position does not even really believe it himself, as is often said in such cases. Those who do not accept what is logically evident as such become internally divided, and this division weakens them in comparison to those who accept and affirm the evidence. The acceptance of logical evidence makes one stronger. To reject it, conversely, is to grow weaker. For classical philosophy, the power of reason becomes manifest here. Reason is the power capable of internally weakening and even ultimately vanquishing the enemies of reason, those who reject what is evident, solely through language and logic, solely by exercising the force of logic. But this raises the question of how such logical evidence can and should be generated. An initial assumption might be that what is logically evident appears in an act of speech that contains no internal contradictions, and being thus coherent presents a consistent argument. Mathematics is usually held up as a model for this kind of evidence, and indeed anyone who is confronted with the statement A plus B, B plus E can hardly defy the evidence of this statement. But how is such logical evidence made available within political arguments, which do not invoke the axioms and theorems of mathematics, but instead try to formulate what is good and what is harmful for the state. For Plato, at least at first glance, the criterion of logically valid convincing speech likewise appears to be its coherence, that is to say, its lack of internal contradiction. Whenever Socrates diagnoses an internal contradiction in a speaker, he immediately disqualifies that speech as non-evident, exposing the speaker as unfit for the just exercise of state power. Socrates' questions break through the smooth, glittering surfaces of sophistical speech and uncover its contradictory, paradoxical core. It emerges that such speech only superficially appears to be well-knit and coherent. In its internal logical structure, however, it is obscure and dark because it is paradoxical. Hence, such speech cannot serve as a manifestation of clear and evident thinking, but is good only as a commodity in the marketplace of ideas. The principal reproach directed by Socrates against the sophists is that they compose their speeches solely for the sake of payment. This allows an initial definition to be given for the functioning of paradox. A paradox that conceals its paradoxical nature becomes a commodity. But how does one achieve a language so completely evident that it no longer merely circulates as a dark and obscure commodity in the marketplace of ideas, but instead becomes capable of serving the transparent self-reflection of thought? For only a language whose evidence is internal and not merely superficial can generate the persuasive force capable of governing the world. At first glance, it indeed appears plausible that completely evident speech should be contradiction-free, coherent, and logically valid. Systematic efforts to generate such paradox-free speech begin at the latest with Aristotle and continue to the present day. But observant readers of the Platonic dialogues will have noticed that Socrates, for his part, in no way endeavors to produce coherent and paradox-free speech. He is content with discovering and revealing the paradoxes in the speeches of his opponents, and rightly so, for simply by exposing the paradoxes hidden beneath the surface of sophistical speech, evidence of such intense effulgence shines forth that listeners and readers of the Platonic dialogues become fascinated and for lengthy periods are unable to tear themselves away from him. It is entirely sufficient to point out the hidden paradox, to uncover it, to disclose it, for the required evidence to arise. The further step of formulating a contradiction-free discourse is unnecessary. The reader already trusts Socrates' words, thanks to this evidence radiating solely from the paradoxes that Socrates has exposed. In light of this evidence, Socrates acquires the right to talk in myths, examples, and suggestive analogies, and nonetheless achieves credibility. Nor does Socrates ever contend that genuinely paradox-free speech is actually possible or even desirable. Speech, in other words, of perfect sophistry, which would be coherent not only superficially but also internally. To the contrary, Socrates not only uncovers the paradoxes of others, he also makes paradox the basis for his own activity simply by positioning himself as a philosopher, that is, as someone who, while certainly loving and seeking wisdom in the sense of perfectly contradiction-free and self-evident speech, neither possesses such wisdom now, nor in all probability ever will. There can never be a perfect sophist. The ideal of entirely contradiction-free speech remains forever unattainable, and is fundamentally superfluous. Socrates only appears to pursue the discovery of the paradoxes that he diagnoses in sophistical speech with critical intent, that is, with the aim of cleansing this speech of its paradoxicality. What Socrates actually shows is that no speech can avoid being contradictory. If we understand philosophical thinking to be the exposure of the inner logical structure of a discourse, then from the perspective of genuine thinking, the logical composition of any discourse can be described in no other way than as self-contradiction, as paradox. Logos is paradox. The impression of an absence of contradiction can be conveyed only by the rhetorical surfaces of speech. The democratic demand for the equal rights of all opinions and discourses correlates with this Socratic insight into the paradoxical composition of every discourse, of every speech, and of every opinion. Under the conditions of democratic freedom of opinion, Opinions cannot actually be classified into coherent or true opinions and incoherent or untrue opinions. Such a division would be blatantly discriminatory and anti-democratic. It would be anti-democratic because it would undermine the equal opportunities of opinions and encroach upon their free and fair competition in the open marketplace of ideas. The axiom of the democratic marketplace of ideas states that there is no privileged metaphysical, metalinguistic position that would allow distinctions to be drawn between opinions, not only with respect to their success in the marketplace of ideas, but also with respect to their truth, be that the truth of logical coherence or empirical truth. In the context of the free circulation of opinions, it can be stated only that some opinions are more popular or more able to win over a majority than others, without them automatically becoming more true as a result. Although there is a widespread prejudice to the contrary, Nietzsche is in fact one of the most rigorous thinkers of democracy and at the same time the prophet of the free market, for he abolished the privileges of true speech and proclaimed the equal rights of all opinions. It would be futile and, moreover, very nearly reactionary to attempt to reinstitute a distinction today between true and untrue ideas. What needs to be established instead is that every doxa is paradoxical. As had already been shown by Socrates, no one who speaks under the conditions of freedom of opinion knows what he actually means. Although most people believe that their ideas contradict other ideas and are polemically directed against other ideas, these ideas in fact contradict only themselves. Every speaker says what he intends to mean, but he also says the opposite of this. All the opinions that circulate in the free market of ideas are characterized equally by this state of internal contradiction, internal paradox. For this reason, the philosopher can conceive of what is common to all discourses, of the totality of discourse, and can transcend mere opinion in this way without thereby asserting a claim to the truth of his own opinion. Indeed, the philosopher actually has no meaning of his own at all. He is simply not a sophist. Philosophical thought is established not at the level of individual opinion, but rather at the trans-individual level of what is logically common to all discourses. This more profound logical level, which transcends the surfaces of the free marketplace of opinions, is the level of the self-contradiction, the paradox that forms the internal logical structure of all opinions. The difference between sophistical discourse and philosophical discourse consists solely in that philosophy explicitly thematizes the self-contradiction that sophistical discourse seeks to hide. Therefore, when Plato asserts in the Republic that the philosophers should rule the state, and takes the philosophers to be those who by definition are not wise but merely strive for wisdom, a paradox is invoked that is clearly intended by Socrates to be the greatest possible paradox, one capable of grasping the paradoxical composition of any discourse whatsoever. This paradox, by which Socrates describes his own situation, should not be eliminated or transcended, nor should it be deconstructed. Instead, this paradox provides the basis for the philosopher's political claim to power. Thus it becomes clear that, for Plato, only paradox is capable of generating the evidence required for governing the world by the force of logic. The Platonic state is founded on the evidence of a paradox and is administered by that paradox. The principal flaw of sophistical speech consists solely in the fact that it hides its paradoxical condition, not in the fact that it is paradoxical. Instead of letting the paradox shine forth, the sophist obscures it by hiding it behind the smooth surfaces of a discourse that only appears to be coherent and logically valid. Paradox then ceases to be the place where the logical structure of language is revealed most clearly, and instead becomes the dark core of a glittering speech that is inevitably suspected by listeners of harboring the hidden influence of private interests, secret manipulations, and unconfessed desires. For as is generally known, interests and desires are obscure and ambivalent. It could be said that sophistical speech replaces the logical evidence of paradox with the obscure ambivalence of the feelings. The work of the philosopher, by contrast, consists in allowing the purely logical and linguistic composition of the paradox to shine forth, and thereby simultaneously bringing to light and transforming into light the dark core of speech that is only apparently logically valid. The sophist is an entrepreneur who offers the empty surfaces of coherently articulated speech to anyone who wishes to be concealed behind them. The real attraction of the linguistic commodities offered for sale by the sophist is represented less by their logically valid surfaces than by the dark space behind those surfaces, where customers can settle in comfortably. Listeners are encouraged to appropriate the obscure core of sophistical speech in order to fill it with their own concerns. In other words, speech that hides its paradoxical structure becomes a commodity that invites penetration into its paradoxical interior. But all speech that is presented as logically valid is sophistical. The dark space of the paradox, which lies concealed beneath the surface of coherently constructed speech, can never be entirely eliminated. It is true that the rules of formal logic seek to exclude paradox completely. But we know, at least since Russell and Gödel, that even mathematics is paradoxical, particularly when mathematical propositions refer to themselves and to the whole of mathematics. The self-referentiality of language, however, is impossible to escape. Of course, an outright prohibition can be placed on speaking about the whole of language and about the logos as such, as Wittgenstein once demanded. However, such a prohibition is not only unnecessarily repressive, but is also once again contradictory in itself, for one must speak about the whole of language to be able to prohibit such speech. Ultimately, every proposition can be interpreted as a proposition about the whole of language, because every proposition belongs to the whole of language. Sophistical speech appears to be coherent only because it is one-sided, because it is cut off from the whole, and because it obscures its paradoxical relationship to the whole of language. The sophist continues to deliver his plea for a particular position even though he knows that there is much to be said at the same time for the opposing position. In endeavoring to lend his utterance coherence and consistency, the sophist employs in his speech only those arguments that strengthen the position he represents, passing over all possible opposing arguments in silence. The sophist thereby replaces the whole of language with the whole of capital. The most important rule of formal logic, which all coherently constructed speech professes to follow, is tertium non datur. This tertium, however, which is excluded from coherently organized language, becomes money, and, as the obscure core of language, begins to rule over it both externally and internally, transforming it into a commodity. The conflict of positions, each of which represents a distinct, private, one-sided, and particular interest in a coherent and consistent manner, leads ultimately to compromise. Compromise is indispensable in such arguments because it alone can bring peace between the conflicting parties, and thus preserve the unity of the whole society. Compromise simultaneously accepts and endorses two opposing assertions, A and not A, and in consequence its form is actually that of a paradox. But in contrast to the paradox, compromise is formulated in the medium of money, not in the medium of language. In other words, compromise involves financially compensating both the advocates of A and the advocates of not A for accepting the truth of the opposing position. The sophists, who have argued in favor of both sides, receive financial compensation in just this way. It could be said, therefore, that when paradox is replaced by compromise, power over the whole passes from language to money. A compromise is a paradox that is paid not to reveal itself to be a paradox. The philosopher, by contrast, allows the full logical evidence of the hidden paradox to shine forth. This brilliant radiance of the paradox is due first to the effect of sudden sincerity, the unconcealing of what had been concealed, the exposure of what had previously remained beneath the surface. Sophistical speech is internally structured by paradox, and as long as this paradox remains obscure, Sophistical speech is necessarily suspected of being manipulative and of serving obscure interests. The philosopher confirms this suspicion by exposing the paradoxical core of sophistical speech. As a result, this suspicion is converted into unconditional trust in the philosopher who has performed the exposure, albeit only for a certain time. The addressee of sophistical speech is the people, but the people are fundamentally mistrustful. In particular, they mistrust slick, well-constructed, eloquent speech. The speaker may be admired on account of his eloquence, but he is not trusted. Socrates makes the people's mistrust his own, and agitates against the sophists in the name of this popular mistrust. It is no coincidence that people who work with their hands, such as shipwrights or physicians, are always mentioned with praise in Socrates' speeches, and held up as positive models in opposition to the lying sophists. And yet, at the same time, Socrates asserts the supremacy of those who concern themselves with the whole, with the totality, rather than pursuing only partial occupations, as the majority of the people do. Socrates' strategy is also paradoxical in tactical respects. He allies himself with the people against the educated elite, and simultaneously with the elite against the people. Everyone is equally irritated by this, to be sure. But that scarcely troubles the philosopher, for the philosopher wants to lead, not to mislead. And for that he requires not darkness, but light. The philosopher wants to be a ruler who fascinates, illuminates, dazzles, and leads with the light of the revealed paradox. Yet this complicated play of trust and mistrust, which continually produces the effect of evidence, is insufficient in itself to explain the specific composition of the evidence that appears when a paradox is revealed by philosophical discourse. This evidence has a quite particular character because it bears reference to totality. A paradox is an icon of the whole of language. That is, a paradox consists in simultaneously holding A and not A in the mind as true. But the whole of language is nothing other than thinking the unity of all possible propositions A and not A, which follows already from the fact that, according to the rules of formal logic, all the sentences of language can be derived from paradox. A paradox is an icon of language because it offers a viewpoint over the totality of language. But a paradox is only the icon of language, and not, for instance, its mimetic image, because the paradox does not reflect an always existing and pre-given linguistic totality. Rather, the paradox is what first allows this totality to take shape. As a representation of God, an icon in the Christian tradition is similarly an image for which there is no original, for the God of Christianity is invisible. The paradox that is discovered, or rather created by the philosopher, is an icon of the Logos as a whole, and precisely for this reason the evidence it possesses and radiates is absolute, for this evidence cannot be obscured by any comparison to an original. The light of the evidence produced by exposing a paradox can be exhausted over time, however. As the Russian formalists might say, with time a paradox is automatized, and is no longer perceived as a paradox, but is instead perceived almost as something that can be taken for granted. Then the paradox grows obscure, just as old icons darken with age. When this happens, the paradox in question must either be restored or replaced by a new paradox, by a new icon of the Logos. Of course, not all paradoxes become iconic paradoxes, those that give off such an intense effulgence of evidence and represent the whole of the Logos so brightly that they generate a surplus of evidence sufficient to allow the whole field of politics to be governed philosophically, at least for a certain historical period. Throughout its entire history, philosophy has constantly tried to discover or invent new paradoxes in order to gain the upper hand over one-sided scientific and political discourse. The history of philosophy can be represented as a collection of iconic paradoxes in which each radiates its own evidence without contradicting the others, for paradoxes cannot contradict each other. That is why the so-called theories of philosophy can coexist peacefully, so-called because they are not in fact theories at all, whereas scientific theories are in competition with one another. The will to paradox already played a decisive role when Descartes provided Western philosophy with a new foundation. Thinking subjectivity was understood by Descartes to be the location and medium of doubt. With regard to the self-contradictory opinions with which the listening or reading philosopher is constantly confronted, the Cartesian epoch means nothing other than the decision to live in paradox, to endure paradox, for the decision to suspend all opinions is logically just as paradoxical as the decision to affirm or to reject all opinions. The effulgence of evidence emanating from this paradox has illuminated all modernity. And this paradox alone makes Descartes' apparently coherent and methodologically correct expositions plausible, for on closer examination, the formal logical evidence being presented is quite problematic. The evidence of the Cartesian method is borrowed evidence, borrowed from the paradox that this method takes as its point of departure. When the Cartesian epoch is later repeated by Husserl in another form, Husserl's ostensibly evident phenomenological method likewise lives de facto upon the evidence of the paradox represented by the phenomenological epoch. The search for newly brilliant paradoxes has intensified even further in recent decades, above all in French philosophy. Whatever else needs to be said about the individual discourses of Bataille, Foucault, Lacan, Deleuze, or Derrida, one thing cannot be disputed. They all speak in paradoxes. They affirm paradox. They strive for an ever more radical and all-embracing paradox. They oppose all efforts to flatten out paradox and to subsume it within formal, logically valid discourse. In this way, these authors actually locate themselves in the best philosophical tradition, namely the Platonic tradition. But at the same time, they see themselves, and each, to be sure in his own way, as dissidents from this tradition. For these authors, that is, paradox does not radiate the evidence of reason, but instead reveals the obscure other of reason, of the subject, of logos. Paradox arises for these authors as a consequence of language being occupied from the outset by the forces of desire, of the corporeal, of the festival, of the unconscious, of the sacred, of the traumatic, and/or as a consequence of the materiality, the corporeality of language itself. That is to say, paradox arises at the linguistic rhetorical surfaces of discourse, and not at the more profound, hidden levels of its logical structure. Consequently, the shattering of the surfaces of an apparently coherent and rational discourse is not interpreted as the revelation of the internal logical structure of this discourse, that structure which is necessarily paradoxical, but is interpreted instead as a manifestation of the other of logos, which acts directly upon the surfaces of language and, by flowing through these surfaces, infiltrates and deconstructs all the logical oppositions that allow a coherent discourse to be fashioned. This peculiar gesture of the self-abnegation of philosophical thought can only be understood if it is borne in mind that these authors clearly accept only formal, logically valid, coherent, and contradiction-free language to be the language of reason. Everything that is paradoxical is exiled from reason and situated in the other of reason. Only the subject of coherent language, that is, only the sophist, is here regarded as the subject of reason. But because it is claimed at the same time that a genuinely coherent language is impossible, the subject of reason is declared to be dead, or at a minimum, is banished to the obscure kingdom of shadows that lies beyond reason. This revolt against the subject of sophistical, formal, logically valid discourse is additionally understood to be a political revolt against the institutions of the dominant power. For capitalist modernity is diagnosed as a territory ruled by the reason of clear, calculating, and contradiction-free argument. Readers of Foucault indeed receive the impression that modern industry, prisons, hospitals, and the police have only a single goal: to force humans to submit to the authority of formal, logically valid reason. And for many, this authority appears to be total, and every revolt against it seems doomed to failure. Power and knowledge, both structured according to the rules of formal logic, here constitute a unity from which no speaker can escape, because there is no speaker who can avoid arguing coherently. On this basis, the encounter with the other of reason also proves to be an impossible task for Derrida, for it is impossible to see darkness in the dark. Only against all reason can deconstruction hope for such an encounter. It can never achieve it. The system is too strong. Reason is too almighty. Rational calculation is too unavoidable. To be sure, the revolt against reason is necessary, but it is also impossible because the rule of reason cannot be broken. That is why those who speak in paradoxes today appear as philosophers maudits, who, traumatized by life, driven by the forces of desire and hopelessly gone astray in the obscurity of language, explode or deconstruct rational discourse with paradox. In this diagnosis, modernity is governed by reason that operates and calculates formal logically, and that places us helplessly at the mercy of its power. But to an unprejudiced observer, this diagnosis appears as nothing less than astonishing. Here, the real relations of power are truly turned on their heads. In reality, sophistical and apparently rational discourses still serve the market and particular interests today, as they have always done. Rationality here is in no sense the insignia of power, but instead functions as the design of a linguistic commodity that conforms to the market. There is no such thing as the total rule of reason, of the system, or of structure. It is common knowledge that the hand which governs the market is invisible, that is, that it operates in the dark, in paradox. The whole of capitalism appears in the medium of money, not in the medium of language, and most particularly not in the medium of a rational language. As is generally known, success in the market does not depend on calculation, on coolly logical reasoning or rational reflection. Instead, it requires intuition, obsessiveness, aggressiveness, and killer instinct. Therefore, discourse that seeks out reason's obscure other is in no way oppositional with respect to capitalism. The discourse of desire appears to be iconoclastic because it smashes the smooth surfaces of coherent speech so that these surfaces can no longer serve as a medium for the representation of certain matters of fact, for the formulation of certain projects, for arguing in favor of certain points of view, or for presenting certain visions. And the institutions that use and administer such speech are also implicated in such a critique. But these institutions are not institutions of power. For its part, capitalism, in fact, lives by criticizing institutions and subverting stable worldviews. It translates convictions into interests and makes compromises that have the structure of paradoxes. Only sophistical instrumental language is affected by criticism directed against the ideal of self-transparent rationality. The discovery of the paradoxical core of a sophistical speech awakens a suspicion that is much more profound than the belief that behind reason, reason's other lies concealed. What is instead awoken is the suspicion that behind the surfaces of conventional and lucid reason, another reason is hiding, diabolical, evil, and obscure, a reason that thinks in paradoxes and that profits equally from all opposing positions. The sophists were always seen as such unconfessed diabolists, capable of arguing equally convincingly for diametrically opposed positions. But it is capital that should be preeminently regarded as diabolical, because capital can profit from A as well as from not A. If the workers receive higher wages, they can buy more, and profits grow. If the workers receive lower wages, savings can be made on labor power, and profits continue to grow. If there is peace, profits grow thanks to stability. If there is war, profits grow on account of the new demand, and so on. The impression thus arises that capital is by no means anonymous, but rather that behind capital a diabolical subject is hiding, a subject that plays a win-win game that it alone always wins because it profits equally from opposing outcomes. However, this more profound suspicion can be neither confirmed nor disproved, for this diabolical subject can be represented only in black on black, and thus cannot be seen. But precisely for this reason the diabolical subject is suspected of governing the world as a whole, in its totality, because the world appears to us as a unity of opposites, as an ontological paradox that can never be perfectly resolved into coherent discourse. Now the philosophical subject, in other words, the revolutionary subject, is constituted precisely by appropriating this diabolical reason, which otherwise remains hidden and operates in darkness, and transforming it into dialectical reason by means of its linguistification. Only the suspicion that there is not just capital, but also a world conspiracy of capital, that is to say, a power that operates behind and by means of capital, and that always triumphs whenever capital wins, which is to say, literally always. Only such a suspicion leads to the constitution of the subject who wishes to reveal and appropriate this power. It could easily be said that such a suspicion is paranoid, unfounded, unprovable, and ultimately a slanderous lie. However, every revolution begins with a lie, as Alexandra Koyeva justly remarks in his commentaries on Hegel's philosophy of right. With equal justification, Koyeva also points out that the responsibility for the emergence of such a slander does not rest with those who formulate and utter the slander, but with the rulers who, by virtue of the obscure and opaque aura of power that surrounds them, first createth the possibility of allowing this suspicion to emerge. Revolutionary suspicion is the effect of paranoia, but this is not a case of subjective paranoia, which could be cured psychiatrically or psychoanalytically, but rather of an objective paranoia, the conditions of whose emergence lie in the object itself, which arouses suspicion by appearing as an obscure object, one that recoils from the coherent arguments of reason. The whole world appears to us in this way as just such an obscure object, one that necessarily arouses the suspicion of harboring in its interior a diabolical reason that rules through paradoxes. In the Western cultural context, capital rarely falls under such suspicion, but the example of terrorism provides a good illustration of the operation of this suspicion, for in recent years terrorism has become an object of objective paranoia. Today, for instance, when Western politicians call for a war on terrorism and simultaneously for the preservation of traditional civil rights, there is a paradox, for these aims contradict each other. In this case, the usual tendency is to speak of a politics that makes compromises between two demands, the demands for security and for civic freedoms. But the word compromise is misleading here. One could speak of compromise if in society there were two groups of the population, one of which wanted the preservation of freedoms, including freedom for terrorism, and the other which wanted the abolition of all freedoms, including the freedom of terrorism. But it is perfectly clear that two such groups do not exist. Or if they do exist, then both groups are too marginal. It simply does not pay to fashion a compromise between such marginal groups. Those who believe in these two logically valid alternatives are instead categorized as freaks, as freedom freaks or as security freaks, and accordingly are not taken seriously. The healthy majority of the population, just like the reigning policy, does not believe in these contradiction-free alternatives, but rather believes in paradox and calls for a dialectical politics of paradox. This demand follows from the suspicion that the politics of terror is a diabolical politics, which thus requires a dialectical, paradoxical response. In other words, the initial assumption is that the terrorists want to abolish the liberal social order. In that case, the terrorists will win equally if either of the two contradiction-free alternatives is realized consistently. Either terror is successful because it is granted free rein for its terrorist activities, or it is successful because civic freedoms are abolished in the anti-terrorist struggle. The question of whether terrorist reason is actually diabolical is irrelevant. It suffices to say that the motives of the terrorists are obscure to license the suspicion that such a diabolical reason lurks behind the deeds of the terrorists. Here it is important to note only that when such an obscure object of objective paranoia arises, the response to it necessarily becomes dialectical and paradoxical. The genuine political discourse of modernity therefore appears to be fundamentally different from the way it is usually represented. In most accounts, that is, only those who think coherently and formal logically are regarded as normal within the context of rationalist modernity. Conversely, those who think paradoxically are marginalized or declared to be crazy, abnormal, or at best to be poets maudits. But reality seems to be precisely the reverse of this. In our time, only those who think and live in permanent self-contradiction count as normal, as mainstream. The famous centrist politics is really a politics of paradox that only barely manages to conceal its paradoxical character behind an illusion of compromise. Today, those who seek to argue in formal, logically valid, coherent, and conclusive ways are by contrast regarded as marginal, if not simply as crazy, and in any case as unworldly and unfit for the exercise of power. Now, Soviet power explicitly defined itself as the rule of dialectical, paradoxical reason, as the answer to the paradoxical character of capital and the commodity as described by Marx. The Communist Party combats the conspiracy of capital by appropriating this conspiracy, forming a counter-conspiracy and moving itself, as the subject of this counter-conspiracy, into the center of society, namely, as the governing party. Communist revolution involves exposing, confirming, and materializing the suspicion that behind the illusion of an open society are hidden the closed spaces of a manipulative and conspiratorial power located in obscure paradox. The exposure, proclamation, and appropriation of this paradox are genuine philosophical achievements which empower the philosophers to rule. Soviet power must be interpreted primarily as an attempt to realize the dream of all philosophy since its Platonic foundation, that of the establishment of the kingdom of philosophy. Every communist leader who held himself to be anything at all understood himself as a philosopher, as one whose praxis represented in the first place a contribution to the development of communist theory. In this regard, a practical defeat could be understood as just as instructive, and thus as valuable, as a success. In this, incidentally, communist power can be distinguished from the fascist regimes with which it is often compared. These regimes, though also totalitarian, are namely not total enough. Fascist discourse remains sophistical because it explicitly professes to prosecute the claims of a certain race or a certain state against other races or states. By contrast, communist, dialectical materialist discourse alone takes the whole to be its object. This certainly does not mean that this discourse recognizes no enemies. It does mean, however, that this discourse does not renounce its sovereign power of determining for itself who its enemies are. Communism recognizes no friend-enemy relation that precedes and determines it. Even when the communist movement professes to defend the interests of the working class against the class of the bourgeoisie, the division of society into distinct classes that lies at the basis of this claim is for its part a product of Marxist theory. The communist leadership accordingly always reserved for itself the right of determining who should be declared to belong to the proletariat and who to the bourgeoisie, and when and why they so belonged. To be total means to have no enemies, outside of those whom one has knowingly and deliberately made for oneself. End of Chapter 1.
To hear this audiobook in full, please visit the links in the description below. Thank you for your support.